is utterly dependent upon the contribution of a kind of awareness which he does not even recognize or understand. An awareness inward into value. This kind of sight is a sight into principles. And it may also imply more things. It may imply a sight outside of the sensory range of the five sensory perceptions that we now know. It may represent a connection to a vibratory band which man is unable to recognize, know, or cognize in any other ordinary sensory perception. This would be quite reasonable and philosophically sound, because it is obvious that man must have some cognition beyond senses. If he does not have a cognition beyond senses, he is doomed to live and die in a sensory universe with no means of escape. This was not nature's intention. The individual, in order to be more than he is, must have an awareness greater than is commonly available to him. He may not call upon this awareness. He may not even know that it exists. But unless it does exist, a very subtle evolutionary process in the life of the individual is frustrated. There is no escape from what Buddha called the machine of the five senses. This machine is a squirrel cage. And no matter how much we use these five senses, or how skillfully we use them, we can never see anything except that which is outside of us and around us. And from the reaction to the things brought to our attention by the physical senses, we create the mental instrument. And the mental instrument, therefore, is absolutely locked in the processes of the sensory perceptions. Thus, man can never know more than his five senses report to him. He can never come to a conclusion more vast than their testimony. He can never escape from their tyranny, and he can never avoid or evade the inevitable pressure of their authority. Well, this actually cannot be true. Consequently, man must have some means of cognition which is beyond the sensory perceptions as we know them. This means of cognition could very easily and very well be associated with the comparatively rare phenomenon of what is termed extrasensory perception. Now, extrasensory perception as a term is again suffering from this tremendous determination to make everything scientific. Extrasensory perception today is being approached as glands were approached 25 years ago, as an interesting and wonderful possibility by means of which we hope ultimately to cure the common cold, prevent mumps, or do something of that nature. Again, it has no essential meaning unless by means of it we can learn to read our neighbor's bank book or something of that nature. It is a scientific curiosity, and science is now sitting around trying to figure how we can capitalize it, how we can make it profitable, how we can use it to raise the standard of living, or also, indirectly, to raise the cost of living, although that is what might be termed a concealed purpose. Extrasensory perception is not merely what we commonly think of when we read an article on ESP. Extrasensory perception is the same thing that has been recorded from the beginning of time in the visions of mystics, the strange psychic experiences of saints, the mysterious revelational factor referred to by Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas another great church philosopher, did as much as he could within the boundary of the framework of his permitted thinking. In other words, there are things he could not do, because in his time men just did not do things that were contrary to their faith. It wasn't even a matter of persecution entirely. It was just simply that the human consciousness would not open itself to conscience reflexes by going outside of that which it regarded as right. Therefore, Aquinas was cramped a little in his philosophy and in his research. But he did recognize what he termed the validity of a sixth sense. We had the five ordinary senses, and he gave to us another sense, which he summarized in the concept of revelation. In other words, there was a way of apperceiving as well as perceiving. There was a way of knowing above as well as a knowing below. There was a knowledge to which man ascended, carrying with it a mysterious power or capacity within himself to receive from what perhaps Aquinas would term deity, a kind of instruction which he could receive entirely apart from the physical senses, which might allow him to read a book or listen to a professor give a learned address. Man with his outer ear could listen to the words of other men, but with an inner ear he could listen to the Word of God, or what he termed God, which simply meant the voice of superior, that which was above, or more subtle, or more internal than the ordinary methods of accepting knowledge. Thus man could achieve through reason, which would be the climaxing of all faculties and their coordination, or he could receive through inspiration, which was a descent, a power of a divine life principle, which could impart knowing. That which man gained, we will say for the moment, through his ordinary eyes, gave him a certain lockedness in matter. What we see, we believe. You cannot tell us this world is not here, we see it. You cannot tell us our friends do not look the way they appear to look, because we can see them. Also, we can see real estate. We can see a good investment. We can see all kinds of external things, families, friends, employment, all kinds of external situations are rationally conveyed into us through the sensory perception, and we accept them. We accept them with the peculiar intensity which has made materialism possible as a code of life. Without the tremendous validity of the physical sensory perception, man could never have been a materialist. Materialism was simply the fact that he wanted to believe that the world in which he lived was the world which he could see. And he could not rationally place an invisible world which he could not see above the visible world which he could see as a level of value. Havelock Ellis, in his Dance of Life, explains a mystical experience which happened to him. To him, this was now a more authentic way of seeing. That which was internally experienced, both visibly and audibly. This unfolding of a factual power. A power so real that the things thus seen could be as indelibly fixed upon consciousness as the things seen by the physical sensory perception. Thus the internal experience makes man as certain of idealism as the outer sensory perception makes him certain of materialism. And having once inwardly seen, that man can no more deny what he has seen than the individual who sees outwardly, and therefore cannot deny what he has outwardly seen. The intensity of this inner seeing also carries with it a dynamic which physical seeing does not carry. Plotinus points this out, where he says that although in his lifetime he had only on one or two occasions been given this moment of illumination, that from that time on the material world in which he lived could never again possess him. This experience inwardly was so great that even a long lifetime of habitual objectification back into the sensory world could never, for even a moment, cloud this other thing, this greater thing, which he had seen and known. Ellis tells us practically in the same words, where he tells us that this experience, which occurred to him in almost an inconceivably rapid instant of time, was of such tremendous intensity and validity that it could never be forgotten, and that as a person he could never have the attitudes again which dominated him prior to this experience, and it would not be necessary for the experience to be repeated. It was indelibly set upon consciousness. Now, such an experience as this must be regarded as either metaphysical or simply superphysical. If we wish to assume that without any peculiar or convenient machinery, by a grace of deity, by the intercession of some spiritual power, the perceptions of man can be miraculously quickened, so that to a person for no reason perhaps that he can understand, or for no rational purpose that he can define, a mystical experience can happen to him, perhaps cannot happen to another person, so that by some miraculous intercessional power, 10 people, 100 people in 1,000 years can have this valid experience. This is one view on the matter. The other view, which probably has a little better philosophic content, is that these experiences so described are possible to all human beings, just as certain attainments in this world are possible to all human beings, but that only to certain persons under certain conditions do the experiences actually occur. Also, we know that within a body of society, we have one group which we may call normal. We have another group which lies below normal, which is a kind of subnormal pattern, representing psychological infancy or immaturity. That we then also, above normal, have an ascending order of superior types. Superior not possibly according to some materialistic measuring rod, but superior either in psychic chemistry or in some internal spiritual grace, and that therefore some persons have developed or unfolded their natural potential, so that experiences are possible to them at a given time, but that these experiences are possible to all men at some time, because the structure for the experience does exist in all. If such is the case, then the pineal gland is a prime candidate for being involved in this superphysical situation. A situation that is not miraculous, is not mystical, essentially. Mysticism being only a term by which we try to explain something not generally understood or cognized. But remembering one of the really wise statements of Aristotle, where he says that when physics is properly understood, there will be no further need for metaphysics. In other words, metaphysics is merely a term to cover the undiscovered facts of physics, and that the entire procedure is a perfectly orderly one, and that this orderliness seems to suggest that the pineal gland is in some way a controller, that it is in some way a door, by means of which certain experiences of inward consciousness may be transferred downward into objective existence. It is possible also that this gland is the secret of your sleep-dream phenomena, and that it is this gland which makes the dream remembered or forgotten when we awaken. It is this mysterious gland by means of which that which is not normally available to the sensory perceptions may be impressed upon them from within, particularly in the form of a visual or auditory experience. Thus, that certain things are seen inside. Other things are seen on the outside. And the inner sight may likewise be involved in your psychological processes. And it is very possible that your so-called hypnotic drugs and certain researches that are now being carried on in drugs dealing with psychic stimulus, that these operate because in one way or another they affect the rhythm of the pineal body. The problem of anesthesia and many others, even hypnosis, may lurk in this area, where a tremendous amount of research must still be done. Now, we don't want to entirely devote ourselves to this one structure, but the reason why it seems most valuable to us is because it is still the one around which mystery lingers, which has not been as yet explained, and for which perhaps no adequate explanation can be discovered without the aid of mysticism or philosophy as we know these terms today. That they do represent, therefore, our present approach to this situation. Now, it is not known with certainty in the extrasensory perception field that the activity of this body can be stimulated. Most of the sensitives who have been worked with at Duke's and other places were natural. Their own abilities differed in various instances. A continuous practice or some special effort to increase the extrasensory perception did not generally succeed. Thus, the situation seems to be beyond ordinary control. And the answer must certainly be, therefore, that it is not specialization by volition, but some type of psychic chemistry resulting from the ennoblement of the entire life that must contribute to the intensification of this body. Physically, the pineal gland is associated undoubtedly with the controlling factors of growth. Therefore, this growth process, in the terms of the pineal, is not merely the distribution of certain secretions to cause the rapid development of body structure. This is only a secondary perhaps negative reflex of the gland's action. The positive aspect of it is that it is a releaser into the body of the consciousness factor. If the shock of adjustment is too great at any time, a death is likely to ensue, or at least a serious mental nervous condition develop. This again was explained by a series of circumstances noted in clinic. One of these is the case I have mentioned before of the small boy who grew up in a few months. He grew from being a child to a man in less than 6 months. At the end of a little period shortly thereafterwards, he also died. The sudden development of the body at a tremendous rate of speed. Not only the body, but the mind. This mind became equivalent to the rapid growth of the body, so that in 6 months, the mind attained a basic maturity that would normally have required 15 to 18 years. The child became mentally a man, with a man's attitudes, his approach to life, his acceptances, his thoughtfulness, and all of the elements with which we associate the normal state of maturity. Postmortem proved that this boy had a kind of abscess or tumor on the pineal gland. And evidently, as a regulator, it lost the power to regulate the growth process. Not simply the body, but the growth of the being in the body. Meaning, of course, only one thing, namely an unbalance in the link by means of which being operates upon body, which permitted being to move into body too rapidly and without adequate controls. And the result, the destruction of the body. So that the gland, therefore, has, through clinical research, more or less supported the presumption or the supposition that it has a regulating effect, and that consciousness itself is in some way released into the general structure through this important glandular center. The ancients, if we can still borrow them a little for further thinking, had much to support this in their legends and their lore and their myths. In a way, this gland seems to play the part of the two-faced Janus, the deity which the Latins regarded as the lord of peace and war. This deity had two faces, one facing forward and the other backward, one assumably facing outward and the other inward, and that this deity represented this gland, which has two processes within it. One is that in its being faced outward, it bestows a superior cognition upon things outwardly seen. And when faced inward, it bestows an intuitional or inspirational insight into the causes of things and into the nature of self. That in both cases, this function is more or less occurring all the time. And what we do not realize, I suspect strongly, in our psychology and other researches, is that man is now, for the most part, looking both ways at once, but as yet has not been able to reconcile the mental confusion resulting therefrom, with the result that we use now the insight that we possess merely to interpret the functions of the outer sensory perceptions. We have not recognized that they possess a power or purpose of themselves. Now, in the brain also, there is this other small body, which is called the pituitary body. Perhaps one of the simplest things that we can liken it to is one of the retorts of an old alchemist. It looks very much like a bottle. It has an anterior and a posterior part and secretes a material which is called pituitrin. This gland was likewise of great interest to the ancients. We do not know just exactly why they were so fascinated by it, but we can have a suspicion or two about this particular thing. In the first place, the pineal gland is in its shape very definitely a masculine symbol. The pituitary body is a feminine symbol. It is a receptive symbol. And long ago it was assumed that in the human brain there were two mysterious bodies resembling embryos, and that one of these was male and the other female, and that all mental or conscious process of the human being was the result of a generation taking place, a process taking place between the male and female polarities in the brain, and that these polarities were represented by these two glands. Thus, in the Parzival story, the pineal gland plays the part of the sacred spear of Longinus, the centurion, and the pituitary body takes the part of the sangreal, or the holy cup, these two being the wonderful relics of the ancient faith that were preserved in the castle on the top of Mount Salvat in Moorish Spain. Always this castle is on the top of the mountain, and in most of the representations of it, it is a domed building, perhaps slightly resembling our grand old planetarium out here in Griffith Park. But it was always a domed building, and this domed building was the brain. And it was here that the knights of the mysterious service of the Grail gathered for the celebration of the Eucharist, seated around this great table, much as in the table of Arthur, King of Britain, the table of Camelot. And here also we have the same mystery as the 12 paladins of Charlemagne, the 12 knights who represented the servants of the sangreal mystery. And we have, of course, the orders of the quest. We have man searching for the mystery of the Holy Grail and the spear of Longinus. It is also noted that in the case of Parzival, when Amfortas, the second king of the Grail, took the holy spear down into the valley to use it against the evil magician Klingsor, he threw the spear at the magician, who, however, caught it and threw it back, wounding the Grail king with his own spear. This was much made of in the mystical legends, for it represented the danger of using this power for a destructive purpose, even though that destructive purpose seemed to be justified. In other words, reality will never be discovered by violence, even if it is a violent effort to discover reality. It just cannot be done that way. Two wrongs cannot make a right. They simply make two wrongs and things get worse. But the story of the Grail and the Holy Spear also will be found in the legends of alchemy, where we have the mysterious processes necessary to the perfection of the wise man's stone, the mysterious symbol of the immortal soul consciousness of man. The pituitary body, therefore, is known to secrete a mysterious dew that is called the brain dew in the Kabbalah, and plays a very important part in the distribution of energy. The great Belgian chemist Jean-Baptiste van Helmont declared the mystery of dew. He said that dew captures in it the rays of heaven. And the brain dew of the ancient Kabbalists is supposed to have been impregnated with the energy of the pineal gland and flowing from the pituitary body. This dew, which has then become the carrier of the consciousness of the pineal gland, is then distributed throughout the body, carrying with it certain power, certain meaning, certain consciousness factor, perhaps something we do not even suspect, namely that it may bestow a kind of conditioned consciousness upon even the smallest cellular unit in the body. Now, in the case of the pituitary body, we have certain definite indications that this gland will affect health, that it can be held as a physical growth controlling factor, even as the pineal is a consciousness growing factor. So that we seem to have here the master glands of a system, by means of which consciousness and body are held in equilibrium, and by means of which also the purposes of consciousness and psychic energy are distributed throughout the body. This gives us a possible conscious definition, namely that in the pineal gland we have the seat of consciousness, or the focal point, by means of which consciousness and body meet. And in the pituitary body, we have the seat of psychic knowing, this thing that we call the soul. That therefore, psychic phenomena in general, and the disturbances of the psyche in various psychological problems, may ultimately be traced definitely to the pituitary body, where we have certain danger of aberration. That aberration may arise in the pituitary, and clarification in the pineal has been suspected for a very, very long time. The development of the pituitary body also seemingly has a very strong bearing upon the sense of smell. That in some way this gland was anciently controlled or directed by means of what were called fumigations. In other words, incense. Various types of odors, as in the story of the frankincense in religion. That the pituitary body responded primarily to the vibration of odor, and that it can be affected and modified in its function by various odors. That as a reaction to this, it means a certain kind of vibration. For odor is only possible as the result of vibration. The gland, in its normal function, has also a body normalizing factor, and in cases of disturbance of this gland, we have the tendency perhaps to obesity, or perhaps again to extreme thinness and loss of bodily quality and sufficiency. The gland, when it goes on one of these so-called rampages, produces a distinct physical condition. Now, it is also noted that wherever this gland with its physical problem becomes acute, we seem to have an increase in psychic sensitivity. Nearly all psychics have been inclined to be heavy. They have been inclined to indicate that a certain type of sensitivity is to be associated with at least a minor imbalance of this gland. And that where the individual is hale and hearty, and the gland is working perfectly, he does not seem to be as much subject to imagination, to violent internal experiences, to a kind of unworldliness of attitude, as we find in a great many persons who have a heavier physical structure indicating a different pattern of gland function. Also, the effect of sugar on this gland will have to be further examined because it does tie up in some way with the pancreas. And it's quite possible that the pancreas represents the lower pole of this gland. The function of the various glands through the body are not too difficult. Most persons have had some fair knowledge of them. The principal endocrine glands, of course, are, in addition to what we have mentioned, the thyroid, the thymus, the suprarenal cortex, which is really a double structure, resting in the form of a gland on the cap of each kidney, and the liver, which is the largest gland in the human body, and the pancreas, which is part, of course, in connection with the spleen structure in its function. These various glands have a controlling or regulating action of one kind or another. Let's try and see if we can investigate them just a little more specially. Suppose for a moment we attempt to study the spleen, which is a very interesting gland. And in order to study the spleen, we make a very simple experiment. Let us take a small sheet of very thin rubber, say the size of a sheet of typing paper. And with adhesive tape, we bind this over the area of the spleen, covering the skin over the area of the spleen. If we do this, it will not be very long before we will notice some results. The reason we notice the result is that this rubber protective, which we have placed here, is cutting off certain energy rays. The spleen is like a kind of umbrella. It is almost like one of these radar devices by means of which we can pick up planes at a distance. The main difference being, of course, that the spleen is primarily concerned with picking up energy, not picking up planes. It is a receiving area into which energy flows. And this energy, reaching the spleen, begins to nourish or support the etheric magnetic field of the physical body. Thus, the spleen is associated with the energy by means of which the vital health of structure